Yeah, and we are now live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this session of Carvan. And I'm Ishan Sharma, founder of Carvan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. As you might all be aware, that Carvan is a students-led initiative that is trying to revolutionize the way we approach history. And in our series of conversations, we have another speaker with us today to speak on masjids, monuments, and refugees, rethinking the partition city of Delhi 1947 to 1959. Today, we have with us Dr. Deborah Sutton, who is currently a senior lecturer in modern South Asian history at Lancaster University. Her research interests lie with the cultural and political history of modern South Asia. She is interested in the physical past of Delhi, their animation in the custodian life of the city, and their colonial past with their digital futures. So without further ado, it is an honor and absolute delight to host Professor Sutton, Dr. Sutton, this evening on Caravan to deliver the Caravan special lecture. So I would, I would formally invite Dr. Sutton to deliver the talk. And if participants have any questions regarding the presentation, they can send it through the Facebook live chat. We'll be taking those questions for the Q&A sessions after the event. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an enormous pleasure to re-engage with India and with Delhi, if only by remote. It's been a very long year in terms of getting research done. So this is an enormous pleasure and an opportunity to reconnect with my research for the first time in many months, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. So I want to do sort of three things in this talk. The first is to think about the partition as a defining event in Delhi's history, and to think about the specific history of the partition in Delhi. And I want to do that by looking at two types of refugee occupation in the city. The first of landscaped monuments, of curated monuments in the city. And secondly, looking at the occupation by refugees of masjids, of mosques, and shrines and other sacred sites in the city in the years after 1947. The final and very brief thing I want to do at the end of the talk is quite shamelessly advertise a digital heritage initiative that I'm involved in, where we've thought about new ways of telling the partition history of the city. So I'm afraid I'm going to read this talk, but we'll try and make it, well, the joy, I suppose, of online is you can always mute me if it gets dull. The partition is arguably the defining event of Delhi's extraordinary 20th century. The legacy of partition has become a well-known, even axiomatic aspect of the city's past, though little demarcation of its extraordinary history and effects exist within the urban landscape. The implications of partition stretch across several years after 1947 and bequeath to a proliferation of tangible and intangible fragments. In this talk, I'll think about the partition as an event for a sort of decade between 1947 and the end of the 1950s. I want to think about partition as a spatial history that's marked through the materials of Delhi, the rapid, complex, and contested alteration of urban fabrics, spaces, and identities by displacement offers a material and spatial history of both the social experience of partition and the crisis of definition faced by the custodians of the city. These displaced people adapted and altered structures and places across the city. These contingent alterations and the indistinct custodies they revealed offer an important means to subvert the quotidian history of partition as a narrative of distinction and difference. In a crisis of global proportions, 7 to 8 million people were displaced in the creation of the boundaries of the two new sovereign states of India and Pakistan. Over 1 million people lost their lives. The migration began before the announcement of the boundary on the 17th of August 1947 and continued for many months and in some parts of the subcontinent for years. Although indelibly associated with August 1947, partition was not a chronologically defined and delimited event, but a complex set of processes, the ramifications and afterlives of which continue to define the subcontinent. This paper examines refugee occupation of two different types of place in Delhi: spaces of Islamic devotion, shrines and masjids, and state-controlled landscaped monuments. These inhabitations took place amidst a period of profound unrest, displacement, and uncertainty. Each type of structure was part of an existing urban order, and each was transformed by the hiatus of partition. The occupation of these sites was animated by rumour, bureaucratic and political responses that resonated far beyond their specific urban localities. The material history of refugee occupation, as well as being far more sustained than is often presumed, represent a significant and largely unrecognized aspect of the city's heritage. So I want to turn to look at the history of the partition history of Delhi. The demographic impact of the partition was immeasurable and multifaceted. The city was transformed in a matter of weeks by the arrival of around 500,000 refugees and the displacement of around 300,000 of the city's Muslim inhabitants. In September 1947, 30,000 people were accommodated in 24 camps scattered across Delhi, each containing between 700 and 2,000 people. The tens of thousands of others who entered the city stayed as guests in homes, others on the streets, setting up makeshift encampments on available land. Less than a month after the political formalization of partition, the September massacres broke out in the city. Homes and hospitals were attacked, shops were looted, vehicles carrying refugees and relief supplies were ambushed. In the years following the partition, settlements built to accommodate refugees considerably enlarged the spread of the city, most especially in the south and in the east. Even with this urban expansion, population density increased as the number of people living in the city almost doubled between 1941, profoundly affected by the Second World War, and 1951. The city's monuments provided immediate shelter for those forced to migrate. The imperial city had been designed around a number of carefully curated and landscaped remains that ran from Shahanabad in the north to the Qutb Minar in the south. In 1947, these monuments and their grounds provided immediate spaces of shelter and assembly for people displaced by violence within the city and subsequently arriving into the city from what was now Pakistan. In 1947, the Purana Kila, Humayun's tomb, and other sites in Nizamuddin became camps for Muslims displaced within the city by violence, in particular from the old city, and by high-reaching deals struck between the political and landowning classes of the capital. In 1948, along with Safdarjan's tomb, these sites were run by the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation as camps for Hindu refugees moving into and through the city. Monuments became what Aditi Chandra has described as unexchangeable assets, places and structures that were indelibly altered by partition, but could not be returned, removed, or displaced. The camps were spaces within the city in which refugees could be concentrated, overseen, and where the limited rations available to them were stored and distributed. Few amenities were provided to the first camps inhabited by displaced Muslims. Greater provisions and adaptations were made for their subsequent occupation by non-Muslim refugees, in part because of the pressure Gandhi exerted on the authorities shortly before his death in the city at the beginning of 1948. In February 1948, 17,000 people were living around Humayun's tomb. The tomb, having closed briefly, was opened once again as a camp at the end of 1948 after a fire in the Kingsway camp in the north left 10,000 refugees without shelter. By January 1949, there were 3,000 people camped around the tomb. Latrines, baths, and pucka-walled structures were constructed in the grounds. At Firozshah Kotla, occupation extended beyond the precincts of the official camp, and an additional informal settlement was established in the southern enclosure. The Purana Kila had been used as a camp just 5 years earlier from 1942 to house over 2,000 Japanese internees. Partition refugees at the Purana Kila were accommodated in tents and dalans within the walls of the fort for the first 18 months. Flimsy tenements were then constructed, consisting of single unventilated rooms measuring only 12 foot by 12 foot with asbestos roofs, for which the ministry charged refugees 12 rupees a month. Dry latrines constructed from corrugated iron were provided, and 20 water pipes provided shared, limited and squalid sanitation to 1,000 refugee families. In 1951, amidst protests from the inhabitants at the camp against poor conditions, a proposal was made to establish quarters and shops, drains and filtered water supply. The conditions of the Purana Kila camp were poor, but the relatively better off and better educated refugees housed there had the means to communicate their predicament to the authorities and to the city at large. The refugees at the Purana Kila used the lost sacred past of Multan, by then in Pakistan, to represent the abominable heat of the asbestos-roofed tenements in which they, quote, roasted like fish in the hands of Shah Shemos Teraz, the 13th century saint who had persuaded the sun to cook a fish he held in his hands. Millap, a local Urdu newspaper, published a statement, or rather a plea, from the camp in 1949. Quote, please read this carefully. The government officials, as well as the police, harass the poor refugees of Purana Kila. Some of their belongings have been thrown away or confiscated by the authorities for no reason. Some of them have also been thrown out without alternative accommodation. The poor, who have no way to feed themselves, are being treated poorly by the authorities. This is shameful. The inhabitants' appeals made use of the enduring status of the force as a monument and tourist resort, making sarcastic mention of foreigners who came to see, quote, the historic Kila, and who are astounded to see these par excellence arrangements made for displaced persons in the capital of free India. Despite the protests of refugees, the camp was inhabited for many years. A settlement evolved inside the walls of the Kila, and in 1959, 5,000 refugees were issued with a positively final notice to quit. The inhabitants preferred to remain in the township that had developed within the walls of the fort than be dispersed into the slum condition resettlement colonies. The archaeological authorities in Delhi controlled significant amounts of land. Particular care had been taken to document and notify structures as monuments in the new imperial capital. Of course, the capital was only finished 16 years before the partition in 1931. The pressure created by displacement led to the abandonment of archaeological protection at Serai Azimganj, a structure just west of what's now the zoological park, next to the Purana Kila. The Serai had been made a protected monument in 1924, but in 1949 was handed over in a dilapidated condition to the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation, together with the 16 acres, and together with 16 acres provided the land of the Sundarnagar colony. Only the mosque at the center of the area was maintained amid the new housing that was provided to refugees. Similarly, in the north, the tomb of Roshana Ara Begum inside the Roshana Ara garden in Badarai had been notified as a historic monument in 1915 and was among the mosques allegedly destroyed by refugees in a list compiled in 1949. From the point of view of the refugees, all of whom were suffering a forced and uncertain migration, the monuments were where life was necessarily to be lived. They had food to prepare, clothes to wash, and schools and children to educate. Schools were started at the Mosque of Safdarjan's tomb, at the Matla Kotla Mubarakpur, and at the Motki Masjid. The rapid, deliberate, and incidental transformation of monuments in their grounds infuriated archaeologists. Archaeological officers complained incessantly about the damage inflicted by makeshift occupation. At Safdarjan's tomb, archaeological officers complained of broken jalis and of plinth stones being raised and broken to be used for washing clothes. Measures were taken to protect parts of the monuments from occupation. At Humayun's tomb, the 22 marble graves on the first floor were encased in masonry. At the Purana Kila, Sher Shah's tomb was badly damaged and black marble inlay work in the walls was removed. The lawns at all three sites, complained the Ministry of Education, had been, quote, ruined and altered beyond recognition. From the point of view of the archaeologists, the refugees were vandals, wreckers of the monuments and their environs, as orderly cultural spaces that had been established and defended at considerable yearly expense. Families living in and around the tomb cut trees and plants, cooked, bathed, urinated, defecated, beat their clothes, drew on the walls of the tomb, and put cow dung cakes out to dry. Archaeological officers despaired of this occupation, permission from which had never been sought from or given by their officers. In addition to these large landscape monuments, smaller monuments within the city were used as temporary shelter by people displaced by violence. In 1948, most of the city's monuments, according to the archaeological authorities, had been occupied. Monuments became homes as door leaves and chalkuts were added to structures to create some privacy. In complaints to government, the archaeological department evoked a civic public space despoiled. Between Mori and Kashmiri gates in the north, refugees, complained the archaeologists, quote, converted these monuments into vast latrines, but everywhere here and there, heaps of refuse and peelings mixed with overripe eatables stink badly in the corners. Also, smoke coming out of their impoverished ovens has defaced the facades, spotted here and there with spitting of beetles. Temporary accommodation soon consolidated itself into more fixed claims. Alternative rights to the land emerged as the society of the displaced attempted to establish lives and livelihoods in the city. At Ajmeri and Kashmiri gates, land was leased and exchanged in spite of the proprietorial claim held by the archaeological department. In 1948, Saudagar Chand began to build a house on land at Ajmeri Gate, which he claimed had been sold to him by a Sardar Harbans Singh for 500 rupees. By December of that year, archaeological officers complained vociferously about the gathering of building materials and the excavations of foundations at the site. The city's police, to whom the monuments were a less remarkable part of a city in flux, appear to have had more communicative and pragmatic relationship with the inhabitants, and assured the archaeologists that the huts being erected at Ajmeri and Kashmiri gates were temporary protection against the Delhi winter. The police refused to move the refugees on. To do so would require the use of force, and the refugees would inevitably return. They had nowhere else to go. I want to turn now to look at the occupation of mosques, of masjids in the city. Hundreds of mosques, shrines, and temples, quotidian places of public resort, were inhabited during the influx of 500,000 refugees into and around the city. The occupation of these spaces gave shape to a set of anxieties in the wake of violence within the city and across the north of India. Custody and guardianship of these structures offered the Indian state the means to attempt to fix a particular category of place at a time of catastrophic instability. On the 19th of September in 1947, shortly after the worst violence against Muslims in the city, an agreement was reached in Delhi between the governments of India and Pakistan, quote, that all those places which are regarded as sacred by one community are protected from occupation by any other community. Particular care is necessary to preserve such places intact, even if they remain empty. This elevated interstate agreement transformed these local places into spatial and cultural markers of discrete and now apparently incompatible religious identities. Whereas monuments were transformed temporarily into spaces in which refugees were concentrated before being eventually, in most cases, emptied and returned to their original function. Attempts were made, at least in principle, to keep devotional sites devoid of refugee inhabitation, though with little or no certainty about the purpose or meaning of this custody, of this suspension of function. With the agreement made in September 1947, mosques became the temporary subjects of diplomacy in some of the earliest diplomatic negotiations between two month-old nations. It was subsequently agreed that all, quote, shrines, temples, mosques, and other religious places which were damaged during the disturbances would be repaired. In late 1947, a committee chaired by Meher Chand Khanna was formed in Delhi to oversee restoration of mosques desecrated during the disturbances. The term restoration implied either physical or custodial restoration, or both. In 1949, an estimated 1,34,667 rupees was approved for the repair of 106 mosques damaged in the disturbances or by occupation. This agreement was one of several that dealt with things left behind or immobile, remnant objects or spaces over which the new states exercised surrogate custody. Custody of the mosques suspended them as between things, held apart from the cataclysmic partition. Mosques on the one side and mandirs and gurudwaras on the other were fixed within an agreement of mutually assured protection, under a presumption that their destruction or transformation was otherwise inevitable. Rumours made sense of uncertainties and insecurities by vaunting the presence of deliberate subterfuge. At the start of 1948, thousands of Muslims returned to the city and were met with rumours about Pakistani spies in their midst. The occupation of mosques was further sensitized by their rumoured reuse either as temples or as gurudwaras. In 1948, the Times of India reported that the daily newspaper Ehsan in Lahore reported, quote, Gandhi is being worshipped in the Moti Masjid in the Red Fort, and that in Humayun's tomb, a temple has been set up on one part and a gurudwara in another. When the Delhi Mandir Raksha Defence Committee advertised in the Hindustan Times in August 1948, offering assistance in the repair of dilapidated temples, the secretary of the Mosque Restoration Subcommittee at the Jama Masjid asked the Delhi government to ensure that such repair work was not carried out on mosques that were being covertly converted into mandirs. Gandhi, who spent several weeks in Delhi before his assassination in January 1948, responded to, and in doing so amplified, the rumours circulating in the city. He condemned the damage inflicted on mosques and described any conversion of a mosque into a temple or gurudwara as, quote, an attempt to bury Hinduism and Sikhism, and as a gross adharma. One of the conditions set for the discontinuation of the fast he began in Delhi on the 13th of January 1948 was, quote, the voluntary evacuation by non-Muslims of all the mosques in the city, which were being used for residential purposes or which had been converted into temples. 5 days after this fast began, Gandhi received a delegation representing hundreds of organizations in the city, promising that, quote, the mosques which have been left by Muslims and which are now in the possession of Hindus and Sikhs will be returned. The areas which have been set apart for Muslims will not be forcefully occupied. This undertaking is interesting in its finality and in its wording, most striking in its overstatement of the capacity of the gathered signatories to effect such promises. The idea of spaces set apart for Muslims echoed the government's commitment to hold mosques aside under an ambiguous promise of restoration. The photographer Margaret Bourke-White recorded a conversation with her taxi driver who was enraged by Gandhi's prohibition against the occupation of shrines and mosques by refugees. He had, she discovered, a relatives-in-law problem that would have driven even a milder man to desperation. His wife's entire family had fled from Pakistan and taken refuge in Delhi, and he had just succeeded in installing them comfortably in the tomb of a Muslim saint when Gandhiji started his drive to get the refugees out of all the sacred Mohammedan places so the Muslim minority could go freely to worship. As a result, the driver's tiny flat was overflowing with uncles and aunts-in-law, a mother-in-law and numerous first cousins, whilst the still more numerous second cousins were out in an open lot. In 1948, the Deputy Commissioner personally visited 16 mosques that reportedly had been converted into mandirs and gurudwaras. The truth of the occupation was more prosaic and complex. Of the 16, 4 were being occupied by refugees with, quote, some portion of them being used as places of worship. These were not cases of conversion, but rather the presence of murtis or images in possession of Hindu refugees. The refugees in these 4 mosques were willing to move if alternative accommodation was found. At the mosque on Church Road, the walls of the building declared that the structure was a Lakshmi Narayan temple, though inside there were no deities. Instead, 3 men from the United Provinces had established a buffalo dairy and were flourishing in their trade. The combination of business premises within the veneer of a religious site was not apparently uncommon. The steps of the Masjid Haji Ali Jan near Chandni Chowk was occupied by a cloth merchant, but the mosque bore a sign saying Mandir Mahatmaji. The incidental presence of devotional objects and the opportunistic marking of the site as a mandir to consolidate precarious rights of occupation are the materials or evidence of social hiatus. Like the damage inflicted to jalis and door frames in monuments, refugees adapted the spaces they occupied in order to live with some comfort and security, not as a calculated attempt to displace or usurp other rights. Their interpretation reveals the diffuse anxieties that beset the political culture of the city, a culture that hinged on the presumption of antagonism between spaces and communities classified increasingly as Muslim and non-Muslim. Of the 16 mosques investigated by the Deputy Commissioner in 1948, the Dargah Masum Ali Shah in Sabzi Mandi had become the premises of 2 businesses, the Lyalpur goods transport business and the Jasbir Singh and Company, displaced from the portion of Punjab that now lay in Pakistan. The Panchkuan Mosque on Reading Road, now Panchkuan Marg, was being used as a school for the blind, an accommodation established by the previous Deputy Commissioner and approved by the Muslim Relief Commission. There's still a school for the blind on the site. 3 of the mosques had been destroyed entirely. 1 mosque from the list could not be identified and might have been one of 3 mosques, said the Deputy Commissioner in House Qazi, none of which were occupied. 2 of the mosques were already subject to ongoing civil court cases. 1 mosque in civil lines was occupied by an Amar Singh who claimed that the building had been a Shivaji temple for 3 years. The Deputy Commissioner's assistant suspected it may never have been a mosque at all. Only 2 of the 16 mosques visited by the Deputy Commissioner were categorized as disputed. One was a piao, a drinking stall on Rajpur Road. The other one was the site of a mosque in Queen's Gardens. The latter site had been disputed for years, having emerged during the Shiv Mandir dispute in the 1930s, and no structure had ever existed on the site. The disputed sites, physically empty but symbolically full, echo the sentiments of the abandoned mosques held back by government or the spaces set apart for Muslims. What little information emerged from these investigations belies the certainty of the lists set before the committee. The lists were the product of suspicion founded upon the mutual antagonism of Hindu and Muslim. They were part of narratives and enumerations of distinction and absence, of spaces set aside and suspended under promises of restoration. The fragmentary information speaks of the poverty of information retrievable in the city's small localities. The archaeological department waited cantankerously for their custody to be restored over the city's registered monuments. While they did so, archaeological officers projected the presumed distinction and mutual hostility of communities onto and into the monuments, and by extension, the city's pasts that they represented or were seen to embody. As displacement, theft, and violence marred the city, one officer remarked that, quote, "Communal riots will not allow one section of the people to visit monuments belonging to the other community on account of fear and mistrust." Public custody of these monuments and the pasts they embodied were now partitioned to imagine 2 distinct communities. After permission was given by the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation in 1948 for the establishment of a school at the Masjid Kotla Mubarakpur, the Director General of Archaeology's objection made no mention to the Ancient Monuments Protection Act, under which the Archaeological Department held custody, but instead evoke the sanctity of the mosque and the injuries already done by the occupation, to quote the religious sensibilities of Muslims. The Director General's argument avoided the preeminent claim of the archaeological authorities based on legislation, and instead offered a proxy communal custody, his statement suggesting that monuments or parts of monuments were conserved on behalf of particular religiously defined publics. In official discussion, mosques were consistently described as having been abandoned. This presumption underlay state custody, therefore, the presumption that underlay this custody placed Muslims, even Muslims that were still present, in some way outside of the Indian nation. The term abandoned also suggests a voluntarism that belied the violence unleashed on the Muslim population in 1947. 10,000 Muslims were killed in Delhi in the riots in the city, and 44,000 homes were abandoned. Gyan Pandey gives a sense of the violence experienced by Muslims in Delhi and their property, including mob attacks on a school, hospital, shops, and homes, and the inadequate and partial security provided that made, and I quote Pandey, a whole community felt defenseless, isolated, and increasingly suffocated. Violence and displacement, both temporary and permanent, were concentrated in particular localities. Of the 106 mosques that the government undertook to repair in 1949, 70 were located in the old city triangle of Kotwali, Paharganj, and Sabzi Mandi. Also within this area were located the majority of the 19 mosques that were reported to have been destroyed in the 1947 riots. The lists created to define state custody abstracted the idea of the shrines from their localities. In practice, these sites remained defined by their immediate surroundings. At Qadam Sharif Dargah, disputes over space did not end after the evacuation of refugees from the central shrine. The refugees moved to the area around the shrine, Nabi Karim. In 1949, the Public Works Departments reported that following repair work, jalis at the Dargah that had been damaged once again and door frames stolen. The adjacent graveyard that had been repaired at the cost of 3,000 rupees at the end of 1948 was once again subject to encroachment and occupation. The engineer responsible concluded that unless and until Muslims had control of the Dargah and the mosque, any repairs carried out would be futile. Later in the same year, the Sunni Majlis-e-Awqaf complained that the theatre had been established over the demolished tombs in Nabi Karim graveyard, and adding communal spice to attract the attention of government, quote, "The construction of the temple is in progress with utmost rapidity." This sense of besiegement is corroborated by other accounts that suggested that the refugees were enterprising in the enlargement of space. Anis Kidwai described the appropriative behavior of refugees in Muslim neighborhoods, quote, "From the minute refugees set foot in a locality, they devote their energies to capturing the neighborhood for friends and family by hook or crook." The Majlis Moini Awqafi Hind appealed for the removal of the refugees who were living around the Nabi Karim shrine, claiming that both worship was impeded by the presence of these refugees and that hundreds of Muslim families were ready to return to the area if refugees were removed. The refugees had been assured that their residence in about 300 houses around the shrine was secure and no discussion of their eviction was permissible. The removal of the refugees from the area around the shrine, claimed the superintendent of police at Paharganj, represented a breach of faith. India being a secular state, Muslims should be able to pass freely to the shrine from the east, passing through the area occupied by refugee families. The idea of a secular nation, therefore, protected the notional access to a local Muslim shrine, but could not enforce the right of displaced Muslims to return to their homes. Many of the evictions carried out in 1948 were temporary. The heavy rains in the summer of 1949 forced refugees to return to the mosques and tombs, breaking locks if necessary. The occupation of mosques continued for years after 1948. The Dargah Sharif on Connaught Place, which is still there, was occupied for 5 years. Conditions within the mosques were poor, and refugees expressed a consistent willingness to leave them. In 1950, 29 refugees had been living with their families for 4 years in a mosque located in the railway lines at New Delhi Station, petitioned to be provided with alternative accommodation. The mosque, they complained, was in a dilapidated state and living in it had become dangerous. The custodians of spaces taken over also complained. The Masjid Shah Abdul Salam, still located on the edge of Connaught Place, was occupied by refugees for a number of years. In 1952, 2 of its Muslim custodians appealed in the name of the Hindu and Muslim devotees of the saint for refugees to be removed from the Dargah. During 1947, the petition claimed the mosque had been occupied and, quote, all of its valuables, valued at thousands, were looted, and the garden as well, and the trees trampled and destroyed. The mosque had been returned by the Mosque Restoration Committee in 1948, but refugees remained in the Dargah. The refugees claimed the petitioners interfered with Friday prayers by playing their radios and gramophones and making other noise. They damaged the tombs, including that of the petitioner's father, and made the performance of Urs impossible. These complaints were not confined to the occupation of mosques and dargahs. Kalkaji Mandir in Okla in the south was one of 4 non-Muslim camps established in Delhi. Refugees remained in the Kalkaji Mandir until 1950 and were the cause of some antagonism. In 1949, a petition was filed by the pujaris of the mandir against the damage inflicted by the 300 families who lived there, many of whom he claimed had been allocated land in Rohtak. The refugees had, quote, destroyed chabutras, the platforms, slaughtered animals, taken and damaged murtis, killed birds fed by devotees, cut down trees, were keeping cattle at the dharamshalas, and threatened to kill anyone who questioned them. 2 shrines had been occupied by refugees, one by a family who was claimed to have placed a charpoi over a statue of Shivji. In April 1949, it had been decided that normality had been restored to Delhi and that, quote, Muslims were moving freely and carrying on their business in all parts of the city. 100 mosques were still occupied, but given the quieter state of the city, the work of the Mosque Restoration Committee was handed over to the Sunni Majlis Al-Kaf, an organization formed under the Delhi Muslim Waqf Act of 1943. The Mosque Restoration Committee would cease to exist, and it would be left for the Majlis to select mosques for evacuation, and then approach Meher Chand to form a plan for alternative accommodation for those living there. Once that accommodation was found, the matter would be passed on to the Chief Commissioner, who would order the police to arrange evacuation. This new arrangement, dividing responsibility between a religious organisation and the civic authorities, diffused the First Committee's commitment to restoration. The winding up of the committee and the transfer of responsibilities to a non-state body did not end, but rather amplified the political question of mosque occupation and restoration. In April 1950, the High Commissioner for Pakistan in India provided a list of 268 mosques in Delhi and its surrounding villages that had been occupied, destroyed, or converted. The Chief Commissioner for Delhi was given the task of investigating and reporting on the list. Each named mosque on the list was investigated. 70 were occupied by refugees, 11 had been converted into mandirs or gurudwaras, 19 had been demolished, and 3 were sealed. The remaining 165 mosques from the Chief Commissioner claimed were actually in the occupation of Muslims. The Ministry of External Affairs and Home Ministry exerted pressure on Meher Chand, Minister for Rehabilitation, to empty the 70 occupied mosques. Meher Chand, however, refused to make the evacuation of sacred spaces a priority and insisted that his ministry's first responsibility was towards refugees who were forced to sleep on the streets of the city. No refugee could be moved unless and until alternative accommodation could be found. refugees occupying shrines and mosques were, however, inadequately accommodated. In 1952, the ministry named the clearance of religious places on its list of priorities, but placed it at number 5, lowest rank. In 1953, the issue was revisited again. 66 mosques were still occupied by refugees, 11 remained as in 1950, mandirs or gurudwaras, and the 19 destroyed were still so. Those that had been sealed off, of those that had been sealed off, 2 were restored and a 3rd was being restored. In 1953, the Secretary for Rehabilitation in the Delhi government, Govind Seth, reasserted the state's right over masjids in the city and proposed that in cases where there was, quote, no Muslim population and the mosques in question are not being used as places of worship, such mosques should be used as dispensaries or schools. The sacred spots will be barricaded and their sanctity preserved. Meher Chand promised only to consider the suggestion and invited Seth to prepare a list of mosques that could be repurposed in this way. Seth's proposed reservation of the sacred spots, whatever they might have been, continued on a reduced scale, the presumption that some empty but significant space could be held back from the permanent transformation of the mosques into something else. The spots would be physical residues, maintained as remnant hostages of the partition that further asserted the imagined absence in their presence of Delhi's Muslim population. The will of the state to maintain any presumptive custody over these spaces appears to have dwindled following Seth's proposal. As time passed and the task moved between various state agencies beyond the Ministry of Rehabilitation, and the will to restore to whom or to what, of what, gradually seeped away. In June 1953, the city magistrate wrote to the Delhi government expressing his frustration at being asked to inspect converted mosques on which he had already compiled a report, and balked at the suggestion that he should compile a list, quote, situated in predominantly Hindu localities. Instead, he suggested that lists be compiled by the police, or if need be, he would inspect them with the Sunni Majlis-e-Awqaf. The state gradually abandoned any presumption to set apart refugee-occupied mosques as a single category of occupation or custody. I want to conclude now. Buildings inhabited by partition refugees were repaired and restored to their previous purpose or custodies, or were surreptitiously acquired in an epidemic of property grabbing. In 1951, the Ministry of Education appealed for damage inflicted on the city's monuments, the pride of the city, to be recognised. The ministry acknowledged the suffering evacuees, but asked that assurances to be made that never again would any serious violation of the archaeological principles inside monuments of national importance be allowed. Refugee occupation in the Purana Kila had followed that of wartime Japanese internees, and the Red Fort had been a barracks as well as a monumental complex. The ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, as it had now been formed, sought to assert a more robust and exclusive jurisdiction over the monuments. Partition transformed localities in fragmented and contingent ways. The custodies raised in response to them articulated grander and exclusive understandings of urban culture, nationhood, and identity. Masjids and monuments were legible to the state, but beyond any meaningful surveillance or control, while displaced people moved into and around the city. The partition history of Delhi offers us the means to understand the contrast between the past and the present in the living city, with its tendency for adaptation and change, and with the preoccupations of archived state narratives, which emphasize empty, static, and abandoned protected spaces. The complexity of Delhi, a city of many shifting parts, in which boundaries and custodies are rarely clear and uncontested, makes an ideal urban canvas onto which the partition heritage of the city can be explored. I want to move then finally on to think about how that exploration may be affected. I'm involved in a heritage app initiative. This is an app called Safarnama, which you can download from Google Play, which allows you to download an experience within the app called Partition City Delhi. All of this, I should say, is entirely free. And within Partition City Delhi, a range of media is geolocated so that as you travel around the city, if you have the Safarnama app, your phone will beep and will allow you to explore aspects, fragments of the partition history of the city through your phone. So this slide gives you a sense of the distribution of points of interest and some of the information that's connected. Thank you very much. And I'll finish my presentation there.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for delivering this lecture. I'll just stop this share. Yeah. No. So you have mentioned many important points, and you have in a way dwell into an aspect of partition that is not much talked about. That is the life of the refugees and how they adopted to a new city. So also the initiative that you have started, Safarnama, is I think the need of the hour when we all are trying to um, reignite the interest in history, and applications like these and even initiatives like the Partition Archives or the 1947 Archives, these are trying to recollect and reignite the love for history and how we can keep those memories alive. So for doing these initiatives, ma'am, and as you have mentioned, the twin processes of independence and partition changed the face of modern South Asia, and the impact on Delhi that we today discussed which had just become the new capital of the free India. It was seismic, and millions were uprooted. Refugees flooded into Delhi from western parts of Punjab and northwestern provinces, and for the first time in history, Delhi became a refuge for millions of people who had no home left. And I remember one of the refugee camps that you showed, that is on the Kingsway, was handled by L.C. Jain, who was a philanthropist, and he also made a university, I think, in Bangalore, L.C. Jain Institute later. So thank you so much for delivering this lecture. It was truly an honor to host you to on Caravan to deliver this lecture.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
And if participants have any question, they can send those questions to carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll share those questions through email to Dr. Sutton, and she'll get back to us through email, and we'll send it to you all the answers. So thank you so much,
Yeah,
ma'am,
very
and
happy.
it was truly an honor for us to host you this
No,
evening.
thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
And we'll post the link to the Safarnama app on the Facebook live chat, so people can go and download that. The link of the app will also be available on the YouTube description, so go check that out. I have downloaded the app just now, and I'm going to get, and I'm going to explore that app now. So thank you so much,
Excellent.
ma'am. And we'll just end the live stream now. Yeah.